In these sessions, you're going to be working with the bodice block. That is the pattern that I have sent you in the post this week. And whenever the bodice block is made up, this is what it looks like. Okay, it's a very fitted garment with 2 darts here in the shoulder and 2 darts here at the waist going into the bust area, throwing fullness to the bust. And on the back we have got 1 little dart here throwing fullness into the shoulder blade here, and a dart going up from the waistline here throwing fullness into the shoulder blade in both sides of the patterns, both sides of the garment. Now what I have sent you is the bodice block. Now I'm going to go through that with you. I'm just going to move the camera back. And what I've done, I've sent you a copy of this pattern here. I have actually cut the centre front line straight. Can you see here? I've already cut that. And I've cut the side seam line for you. So here is the centre front, and here is the centre front of the pattern on the mannequin here, running down the centre front. Okay, so what I need you to do is to cut around the neckline, cross the shoulder seam here, this is the shoulder seam at the top here, cross the dart at the top and around to the shoulder end. Cut very neatly around the armhole. I want you to put a little notch here in the armhole, and that's to help you set sleeves whenever we get around to doing sleeves and styling sleeves in the next couple of weeks. I've already cut the side seam from you, but I need you to cut very neatly across the waistline of the front bodice block, and then I need you to insert a little notch there and a notch there at the ends of both the darts. I've already put a hole at the bust point on your block. Really put a little drill hole in there, which we'll be using later on for manipulating the patterns. So that's the front. Now let's go to the back. Here again we've got the back, and if I turn the mannequin around, you can see that I've cut for you the centre back seam. There's the centre back seam there on the mannequin, and I have cut again the side seam. But what you've got to do is cut very neatly around the back neckline, down the shoulder, down the armhole, notch here to indicate where the little dart is, and put 2 little notches here on the back armhole. Again, that's to help you set sleeves. Then, as I say, I've cut the side seam for you, and on the waistline I need you to cut very neatly around the waist and put in, I want you to actually notch the bottoms of the darts. And once again, I put little drill holes to mark the ends of the darts. Right, over the next couple of weeks, you're going to be using the bodice block to create style patterns. You're going to use the block patterns to create style garments with yokes and gathers and flare and pleats and, you know, panels and all sorts of interesting things. But the very first thing you must learn to do is actually how to actually sew a dart. And that's what you're going to do with me in the next few minutes. So if we look at the bodice block here and the block pattern that I've got, you will see that I have the 2 darts meet in here at this point called the bust point, and I've actually marked that on your pattern with the initials BP, and that refers to that bit of the pattern there. Here's your centre front, there's the centre front of the garment running down there, and that little hole there actually is that point there in on whenever it's sewn, whenever the garment's sewn up. Now that's not very attractive looking because the two darts are running together and it's giving us a big point. So that's not what we want. So what we do, we use, whenever you're manipulating the dart, you use the centre point for manipulating the darts into various locations. But whenever you have created your dart and put it in the correct location, you then move your darts back, the dart ends back from the bust point. So what I've done here, I've got another sample with, again, the darts in this location, but we're going to move this bust point, the end of the darts back from the bust point, and that will prevent the garment from having this horrible sharp point. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking off the toile of the bodice here, which represents the patterns that I have sent you, and what I've done, I've created another one. So here the darts are still in the same location, but the silhouette begins to get an awful lot more curve. So I'm just going to pin this on onto the mannequin. Now, if we look here now, can you see how the silhouette here is less pointy? It's more a curved shape. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you how to move the darts back from the bust point back to an acceptable place where they should be on a finished garment, and then you're going to cut the a bodice out, and you're going to sew up the darts and make it up. Right, now I want you to create an actual pattern for the bodice, and I want us, we're going to make it up. Add on seam allowance, we're going to move the darts back from the bust point. Here you can see the dart is coming to the centre of the bust point, which is marked on your blocks. We're now going to move those points back and mark new darts. We're going to create a pattern with seam allowances, and you're going to eventually sew it up. So, sew up the bodice. So what I need you to do is get some pattern cutting paper. So I've just got enough here. I want to create a full front pattern for the bodice. So I'm just going to fold it over. I've got some spot and cross paper. If you haven't got spot and cross paper, that's fine. Just use any ordinary plain paper you have to support the bodice. So now you can see I've folded the paper over. I've got my bodice block here, and I'm putting the centre front to the folded edge of the paper. Now I'm using weights to hold this down. Now I've got little bags of sand, this is, I use as weights here whenever I'm working from home. But you probably won't have these sorts of things, so just literally physically use something like a stone, or a tin of beans, or anything like that, tins of tuna. Let me just go and show you what you can use. Like literally, I've just gone to my cupboard here, and I've got tins which just hold down the patterns. Or you can just go outside and pick up a couple of pebbles, and it does exactly the same thing as my little blue bags of sand here do. So look, I put the centre front of the block to the folded edge of the paper. I'll just show you that again. Folded edge of the paper, and I've made sure there's enough paper folded over. And once what I'm doing here is actually, again, the centre front is going to the fold line of the paper. I'm using my little weights here to hold my pattern down. And for pattern cutting, I always recommend that you use a Niche B pencil for drawing around patterns, because you can rub it out if you make mistakes and things. But for this exercise, because you know, this is a video and I want to make sure you can see, and the HB pencil's, you know, not very, it's quite light. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be doing this using a little fine marker. So I've just checked the centre fronts to the fold line of the paper. I'm drawing around, got this little notch here, and this is the armhole of your pattern, and it's important that you put that little notch in because you'll be using that later on whenever you start to insert sleeves into your bodice. Throughout these next 3 or 4 weeks, I say you're going to learn how to manipulate the bodice block to create lots of different types of style patterns. Then you'll start working on the sleeve block, and you've got to create all sorts of different styled patterns with me for sleeves. Now, what I want you to do, I want to just put a little dot here at the bust point, which is that little hole in the middle. Bust point. Okay, now what I'm doing, I'm lifting it off, and as you can see, I've marked around the pattern. Now I want you to say, take your pattern master, and with a very light line, I'm going to do mine as a dash line because I'm using a pen. I'm going to connect the dart end, the dart is at the shoulder, down to the bust point, and eventually you'll rub these points out, but I'm doing mine as a dash line, as you can see here. Can you see that as a dash line? And down to the bust point. And the same at the bottom here. Little dash lines I've got here. So that is the bust point. Now what we want to do is, that line's not very, it's quite faint. Now there's the bust point, but we don't want both darts going into the bust point because it makes a very pointy silhouette over the female bust. So you want to take and move the ends of the darts back. So what I need you to do is find the midpoint in the dart here at the shoulder. Right in the midpoint. And I'm drawing a line in the centre of the dart there to the bust point, and I'm measuring up 3 centimetres up that line that I've just drawn, and I'm going to mark in my new dart end. So I'm marking that in a hard pencil line. So that's my new dart location on the pattern. So I can then take my pattern drill, that's the end of my dart, that's the new end of the dart. And what I'm doing here now, I am again finding the midpoint in the dart here at the waist of the garment. Drawing the line up to the bust point, that's a solid line, and I want you to measure down 5 centimetres down that line that you've just drawn. Okay, so, and that's my new dart end, and I'm now marking that in with nice firm lines, nice heavy firm lines. And once again I've got I can now take my pattern drill and that's now the end of my dart. Okay, so what we're going to do now is add on seam allowances. I want you to add on, I want you to use your pattern master. Remember how we did this in class where you literally use the lines on your pattern master. Here, so I'm lining up, we need a centimetre seam around everywhere on this pattern. So I'm just using the lines in the pattern master, and that's my centimetre seam. And I'm doing a nice centimetre seam here around the armhole, because eventually you're going to be sewing sleeves into these bodices that you're going to be making up with me. And eventually, as we get into the module, you'll eventually put collars onto them as well. So that's me drawing and then a centimetre at the bottom. And a centimetre around the neck. Now, where you're doing a curve, it's a little dashed line like this. And then you can use your block pattern as a template to make sure you get a lovely curve on the neckline of your pattern. And there we go, I'm getting a nice curve. I can use the cardboard block pattern as a template to draw around and get the correct shape here on the armhole. Okay, so make sure that little notch goes into the armhole, and we've got a little notch there. Now what we've got to do is label our patterns. So you know that the centre front will always be the grain line, so the centre front line in this pattern is going to be the grain line, and you're to label it with what it is. It's a bodice pattern. It's a front, and it's size 12. And we're going to, because we're cutting this pattern in the fold, whenever I cut around it and open it out, we're going to have one full front bodice. So we're only going to cut out one of these to make one garment. So you right cut one on your pattern. So let me just show you. What you need here, guys, is a pair of scissors for paper. I don't want you to use your really expensive scissors that you've got for cutting cloth. I want you to have a separate pair of cheaper scissors for cutting paper. Now, whenever I'm cutting something out, I tend to cut around it roughly, the way I'm doing here at the minute. Get rid of all the excess paper. It's quite a big bit of paper. I'll use that later on for something. I try not to waste anything. So I'm just cutting around the pattern roughly, and then I can cut around it accurately. Now, so I'm just using my scissors here, cutting around the pattern very neatly. Now, my scissors, whenever I'm cutting, never actually leave the surface of my table. The bottom blade always stays on the table, and that becomes an anchor for me whenever I'm cutting. Now, what I don't want is see people cutting up in the air like this, because that's whenever you get wiggly wobbly lines. So my scissors always stays firmly anchored on the table. Okay. Just put those bits in the bin. So now I've created a pattern with seam seam allowances on it. And eventually we're going to cut this out in calico or some other fabric that you might have in your house. So what I need you to do, guys, is remember, we've already got the little hole here at the ends of the darts. We need to put notches to indicate where the darts begin, top and bottom, on the shoulder, and a notch here in the armhole. You must make sure you don't forget that. So now whenever I open up my pattern, I've got a full pattern. And I can mark the grain line down the centre front line of the pattern. Okay, that's my grain line. Just put little arrows on it. And we'll just write grain line on just to remind us. Grain line, and that is the centre front of the pattern. So now I've created the front, I'm now going to create a pattern for the back. I'm not quite sure what's not. I'll have to just get another piece of paper. Just give me a second. So hopefully this bit of paper is going to be big enough. So I take my bodice block for the back and place it on. Okay, that will be just enough. I'm placing up, look, the centre back here in line with the crosses and spots on my paper. Get my weights down again. I like to use HB pencil for drawing around, for pattern cutting, and that's what I recommend for you. But in this case, I would like, I've got to use this pen so you can see it, basically. Now these darts are all in the right locations. We don't need to move them back from their original point on the block. I'm drawing around the armhole, down the side seam and across the waist of the pattern. And I'm marking the ends of the darts. Take that off and there you can see I've got my pattern. Again, you can mark in your darts. I say these darts remain where they're located on the block. They don't need to be moved back. And all we've got to do now on this is add on the seam allowances. So again, I'm using my pattern master. I'm using the lines on it. And around the curvy bits here at the armhole, I'm just doing a little dash line, and then eventually I will use the block pattern as a template for getting the correct curves on the so it's a nice centimetre seams around everywhere except the centre back, guys. Here's the centre back line, and I want you to add on 2 centimetres here for me, please. So I've just placed my square here at the 2 centimetres. And coming around the bottom here. Okay, so once again I'm using my block as a template. So I get the right curve on the neckline and the same here on the armhole. Now, I need to make sure that my notches go into the out to the edge of the pattern here. So, what I can do now is literally take my pattern drill, make sure I put in the holes label the pattern. So I've got the centre back line is going to be the grain line, same way as the centre front line was the grain line on the front bodice, and eventually we're going to cut this out in a piece of fabric and you're going to sew it up. So we've got to label the pattern. It's called the bodice, and it's a back. My pen's running out, so I'll just get rid of that one. And we know it's size 12. And we're not cutting this in the fold, so we need a left and a right of these. So you need one for the left side, and we need one for the right side. So we say cut one pair. So that means you're cutting a left and a right back to make up one pair of backs to actually make up one garment. Once again, we cut this out, just very quickly cut around it, and then I'll accurately cut it out. As I say, you use pencil for pattern cutting. I'm using pen so that you can actually see it on the video. And pen makes patterns very messy looking. But anyway, it's the only thing we can do so that you can actually see it on the video. Now, what we've got to do now, I've already put the little holes in to indicate the ends of the darts, and we're now going to put in the notches. Remember the notches, we need 2 notches in the armhole, and on the back armhole we always have 2 notches, and that indicates what's the back and what's the front of the armhole. I want you also to put little notches here in at these 2 centimetre, little turning that we've added onto the centre back. So whenever we actually make this up, we're going to turn the cloth over like that, and that's going to give us a little finished edge on the back of our bodice. Now, some checks that's important that you must do on your pattern. The first one is, I'm bringing back my front. Okay, so the very first check you must always do is to check that the side lengths are matching. Now both of my patterns here, the side lengths are matching. Now if I place the patterns together, here seam allowance on top of seam allowance. So what I've got here, this line here represents my seam allowance. That represents my seam allowance. I would take my patterns and I lay the seam allowance on top of one another. I should have a nice shape around the armhole that you can see here. And if I take the same thing here and I move these out of the way, the shoulder ends together, again seam allowance on top of seam allowance, so I'm actually just overlapping them by 1 centimetre. And I should have a nice lovely curve going around the armhole here, and at the neck point here again, whenever I lay the pattern seam allowance on top of seam allowance, you can see that I've got a nice shape around my neck. Now we've created the 2 patterns, we're just ready to cut those out in calico. Now we're going to cut the pattern out on cloth. Now I'm using calico, but you could use, for example, you know, an old sheet that your mum's no longer using, or any other sort of plain fabric that you have. Now what is important is that you iron the cloth before you use it. I don't want to see any wrinkles in cloth that you are using. Now here's the selvage of the cloth. Here the finished edge of the cloth. You know what that means. It's the finished edge. I've got to write selvage on it. Selvage, that's the selvage of our cloth. So we know that the grain lines on our patterns always have to be placed parallel to the selvage. Okay, now what I've got here, I've got enough cloth to cut the whole bodice. I'm folding it over so that I can cut the front bodice on the fold, and you can literally cut the back here as well. So we're folding the cloth over so we end up with two. So I've got enough material here. Yep, I've just got enough material and no more. So what I'm doing, I'm very carefully folding over the fabric. So I've got the edge of the fabric here, that's the selvage of the cloth. I've folded over it in such a way that I'm only using sufficient fabric to cut the bodice out on the fold. So I've got this little bit of extra here at the side. So what I'm doing is here I'm placing the centre front on the fold, and I'm pinning it down with my pins. Quickly pinning it down. Make sure you use sufficient pins. That one's a blunt pin, that'll have to go in the bin. And here I'm just double checking, look, the grain line here is parallel with the edge of the cloth, so I'm just laying it out and I'm pinning it down nice and parallel. Oh, bent pin, another one for the bin. Now you could equally, you could lay your weights down and actually mark around your pattern with chalk. And this is a piece of white chalk and white cloth, so you're not actually going to see this in the video, but I would normally, I could either pin the pattern pieces on, or I can mark around it in chalk, or I can mark it around it in pen. But let's just, in this case, pin the pattern on with pins. And I'm going to use my lovely fabric shears for cutting this out. So again, once again, my scissors will never leave the surface of the table. Very quickly go around the edge, cutting it out. First one cut, and then we'll mark in the notches and bits and pieces, and the darts, etc. in a few minutes once I get the two pieces cut. So put that out of the way. You've got to sew this bodice block, and what you're going to do is, in this exercise, you're going to learn how to sew darts correctly, and I'll go through that with you in a little minute. Extra bit there, it's quite big, I'll use that for a cuff or something. Now I've got my pieces, my two pieces cut out in cloth. The very first thing I've got to do, guys, is with a pencil, I want you to mark the ends of the darts. Now once again I'm using pen here, so I'm going through the little holes I've made in the pattern, and I'm marking the ends of the darts here on the back and the front. Now remember, my cloth's double, so I'm going to have to make sure that I mark exactly the end of the dart on the other side. So I'm taking a pin here, I'm pushing it through the pattern like that, and that's going to tell me where the end of the dart is on the other piece of cloth. Once again I'm taking a pin, doing that. Okay, do the same here on the front. I'm using my pin, pushing it through so I know that's the end of my dart. I'm just marking a little cross there, and the same on that one. So I've now got the ends of my darts located. We just have to notch the pattern. So, ends of we have to work out you have to know where the darts start. So I want you to just cut in for a little 5 millimeter little cut. No more than that. Can you see? At the ends of the darts. I'm just chopping in here 5 mils max. Can you see? No more than that. You must put in the little notch here in the armhole, because you'll need that for setting sleeves and one of our later sessions. I want to just put a little notch here where I'm going to fold the calico on the centre back, and I'm just notching the ends of the darts. I say no more than 5 millimeters in, please. And don't forget to put in the little notches here on your armhole, and that's a little double notch on the back. So take off your patterns, and now we're ready to sew the garment up. We're going to create a little bodice pattern, and you're going to learn how to sew darts on this exercise. It's vital that you learn how to sew darts correctly. So I've got my left and my right back, and I've got my front. So I'm just going to take out the pins, and now I don't want any seam going down the front of my bodice, so I've got it. There's the front of my bodice. So let's look at the front here. So we know that the ends of the darts are there, and we know where the darts begin because we've got little notches up here. Can you see the little notches? And the same at the bottom. And now we're ready to sew the darts. Now I want you to, now you've got the pieces cut for your bodice, you've got your two backs and your one front. I need you to sew up the darts. what I need you to do is go to the book Basic Garment Assembly for the Fashion Industry and go to chapter 6 in this book, and explains exactly how to sew up a dart. And there's also a video which shows you exactly how to sew up the darts and how to press them. So I have already sewn up the darts on my bodice, and I've used red thread. So here my darts have been sewn, and I've pressed the darts towards the side seams of the garments. All darts are pressed towards the side seams in any garment. So I've got my darts here, and I've sewn up the darts also on the back. Again, I've pressed the dart inlay towards the side seam, and I've pressed over the extra 2 centimetres that we added onto the pattern at the centre back. So we've got all 8 darts sewn up, 2 in each back and 4 in the front. So the next thing you've got to do is take right sides of the cloth together. Okay, so that's the right side. You don't actually see the dart inlay. And right sides of the back. So I'm placing, just show you, shoulder end to shoulder end, and I'm going to, so here, let me just show you again here, that's the armhole and the armhole. So I'm placing the shoulder seams together, shoulder end to shoulder end, and neck point to neck point. And we are now going to sew this up with a centimetre seam. So, first thing I'm sewing together is the 2 shoulder seams. So I'm going neck point to neck point, and because we've added a centimetre seam, we're sewing a centimetre seam. Now I'm not in the university, needless to say, I'm using my domestic machine. I'm back tacking at the end of the seam to secure it, and then I'm nice accurate centimetre seam, just running off the stitches like that, just chaining them off and cutting, not back tacking. So what I'm doing is what I'm doing now is taking my back, right sides of the cloth together with right side. So you always sew with right sides together. So putting the shoulder seams together, and I'm sewing with a lovely centimetre seam, back tacking at the beginning, and I'm making sure that I take an accurate centimetre seam. If I take more than a centimetre, chaining off and cutting. I'm doing the same thing. Now I've got my shoulder seams joint together. Let me just see if I can show you. Shoulder seams are joined together. Okay, so now I've got to sew the side seams. If I take more than a centimetre seam allowance, the bodice or the garment will be too small for the mannequin. If I take less than a centimetre, it's going to be too big. So it's vital whenever you're sewing that you take a really accurate seam allowance. You're actually sewing exactly the quantity of seam allowance in the seam that you've added onto your pattern. Just chaining off at the end. I don't back tack often at the end, and I'm sewing up the other side seam. Tack at one end and I chain off at the other. Make sure your edges are nicely aligned, because what we don't want is uneven seam allowances. So now my bodice is sewn. So I've joined the shoulder seams, the side seams up, and now we've completed the garment. What we've got to do now is actually press the seams open in the shoulders and the side seams. So I'm just going to get my iron, and I'm pressing my seams open. Pressing the seams nicely open on the side seam and the shoulder seam. If we were in the university, we would have the lovely small sleeve attachment we have, but I don't have one of these here because I'm working at home. So sewing my seams open, or pressing, not sewing them, I'm pressing the seams open. Okay. And I can now put this on the mannequin. Right, now we've got our bodice sewn up and got our darts sewn, side seams, and I've just got it pinned together at the back. Now what I've done here is put what I call a stay stitch around the neck and the armholes and the waist, because if you don't secure those now and prevent them from stretching, because it's a very stretchy part of the garment, if we don't actually prevent those from stretching now, they'll be far too big whenever you actually go to sew in your sleeves in a couple of weeks' time, and they'll be too big. The neckline will be too big as well. Now all I've done here is quite simple, is take that off. I've just gone around with the lock stitch here, just plain red thread I've got, and I've literally just stitched a centimetre in from the edge of the cloth around the neckline and around the armhole. I've also done around the hem as well. So anyway, that is the bodice complete, and I want you to actually make up a bodice as well. I want you to move the darts, and I also want you to cut it out in fabric and sew it up.